So we're going to make a wood material for our floor here. Okay. And, oops, and while I'm there, I'm going to pause my render because otherwise it's going to slow up my whole machine. So when you're not rendering and doing stuff, make sure to hit the old pause button right here so that it's actually not, it's not taking up a lot of computation. So I want to make a wood floor, and the things you want to think about first is number one, if I'm doing a wood floor, I have to think about how old or new it is, and I also want to think about, this is the number one mistake I see people making when they do something like a wood panel or wood floor or, or walls or whatever it's made out of, is they take one big, humongous piece of wood and slap it on, whether it's painted or not. And that's not the way it works, right? We could see here that it's made of different pieces. There's little knot holes. Now, granted, this one's weathered, but there's different colors to them. The grain is different. We might have some cracks and different things like that. And depending on what it is, sometimes it's more subtle. Like this one, it's hard to see, but there are pieces that are there. And there's there's many different types when you look at it of how it is, right? But you want to show that they're made of different pieces, because if we don't do that, what's going to happen is it's going to look like this was taken from a phenomenally large tree, and instead of cutting pieces that they put together, that somewhere down the line they brought in these pieces that were the size of a wall or an entire floor and just dropped it in there, which is unrealistic, right? So you want to show, nope, we had to bring in these pieces, we had to put them together, they're fitting together, they've been measured, and, it has a certain look. Does that make sense? So when you're actually, that also holds true for when you're doing something like a table, right? So when I'm doing something like a table, and you could see it here, I want to make sure that the grain goes long ways, like this. Right? The grain is going long ways like this. Because if it goes across, that doesn't make sense and is not very stable, and that's not the way they build things. So that's construction history, and then showing the pieces that are, oh, these are different panels that are put together. Okay? So we're going to kind of go for something like that. So I'm just going to show you a few quick techniques for actually doing that. So I'm just going to start off, I'm going to create new, and I'm going to choose, either I'll do a 1K or a 2K texture, right? And then I can always scale it down or bring it down. Let's say we're going to do a 1K just to keep it, and that's 1024 by 1024. Pixels, not inches. And if I'm doing in Photoshop, so I'm doing this, I'm creating a new document, it's 1024 by 1024. The next size up, if I wanted it larger, would be 2048 by 2048. And I want 72 pixels per inch, not 300 or something like that. That's for print. So you want to use 72 pixels per inch, 1024 by 1024 RGB, and I'll just start with a white background, 8-bit, and it gives me this nice square. Okay, so where I might go from here, I'm just going to do like a quick one because it can, this can take forever or it could take a few minutes. So I'm going to do a very quick and dirty one, but just so you can see some of the techniques. So first off the bat, let me just duplicate the background, just drag it into new layer. So now you can see I have a pure white layer, and then I have my background. And on this new layer, Let me start off with a filter of noise. I'm just going to say add noise to it. And when I go to add noise, you'll notice I have a distribution of uniform and Gaussian. And a choice of monochromatic. So I want to use monochromatic because otherwise if I zoom in, Control plus so you can see it. If I don't use monochromatic, you'll notice that my, let me try and crank that up so you can see it a little more. My pixels are all sorts of different colors, right? So I want a monochromatic because this is going to be based off a pattern. And what you're going to notice if between uniform and Gaussian, uniform is more of a median and it basically sticks more towards the grays, just right in the middle. A few variations, but right in there. Gaussian is a much broader, and you'll notice that I have if I'd started out with a 50% gray, you would notice that it's not only giving me black pixels, but it's also giving me white ones. So it's a much wider range that I'm getting. This is really good because it adds depth. So it depends on what you're trying to do. But this is going to start to become some of the grain and the pattern in my wood. So what will happen is darker pixels will be deeper, and lighter areas will be higher when we start to see it, and it'll give more depth. If I don't want it to have too much depth or not be quite as strong, I can use uniform, and it'll give me this. But I'm going to use Gaussian for right now. I'm going to turn it down a bit. Control minus. Let's try about maybe around 23%. This coincidentally is also how I would start to get a texture if I want to texture my walls or something like that, making a normal map from a modified version of this. So first, now I'm going to go filter. I'm going to go to blur, motion blur. And I want my motion blur to be at 90 degrees. And I want you to see this. So look at the pattern. I know it's a little bit hard, I'm sorry, to see it on the projector. Can you see the pattern that it's giving me? Where depending on how much I give it, it's giving me more of a woody sort of a pattern of grain that's going up and down. Now if I push it too far, it's going to be really, really straight and very streamlined. This is going to be more so a choice for you based off of how you want the grain to look and how long. This is more like wood paneling. If I pull it really far, then it's going to be much of a longer grain that's going in. So if I go, just so you can kind of see what I mean. If I go here, I'm just going to hit levels because I know you can't really see it that well. And that's Control L to bring the levels up so you can see the pattern more. Check this out. Do you see that? The pattern I'm starting to get. So as I increase the shadows, just so you can see it easier on this projector, now I can adjust the highlights, the midtones. If I want more depth, I'll pull it here. This is also how I start to do hair when I'm doing hair cards for a character. Right? So I find the pattern that I'm liking, and I'm going to go a little bit more extreme. But the cool part about this also, check this out. This is also potentially, depending on what I'm doing, giving me this edge here, which could be like if you look at certain pieces of wood when they're roughly cut and it kind of chips the edges. This is giving me a little bit of that right here as well. Okay. So I'm just cranking it up so we could see it a little bit more. So maybe a little more extreme than I want, but that's okay. And this is really just primarily going to be my pattern of the grain of the wood. Okay. So I'm working on the pattern before I work on the color. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer. And I could do a few different things with this. Okay. So depending on where I plan on modifying this, I could add the pieces in between inside a substance. I'm going to do it inside of here. So I've got this nice little pattern here, and if I wanted to have planks, I want to get rid of these little edges here because I don't want it to look that rough for my floor. So I'm going to take this layer, Control T, to actually go do the free transform. Alt and left mouse to drag it out so I don't see those edges. Enter. And then I'll just select the whole thing and image crop to get rid of those. Alrighty. Now before I do anything, I can make planks from this. And it depends on how I actually want to break this up. Okay. So if I just want to make planks from this and I want to adjust it, depending on the look I'm going for, I could add them right now. If I go in, press B for brush. And I'm going to choose a darker gray. Use my brackets next to P, and you see that changes the size of the brush. And then I could literally go in and just say, oh, you know what? I'm going to go in. Shift left mouse, and you see I could start to paint in the creases between the planks. I'm using shift so I can get a nice tight line to it. You see that? Let's increase the pressure a bit. I'm just making those pieces as I see fit. Oops. Sometimes I'll do this so that it's actually on a different layer. Okay. Now, if I wanted to have like different variations, there's a few ways I could do it, and I could probably do it even before I do my planks themselves, but I just want to show you how it works. The grain is very straight, which is fine. But sometimes you want it to be like wavy. I could either multiply some different patterns on top of it, or I could take this, let me duplicate this layer, and I'm going to go to Filter, Liquify. And it'll take a second. And here we are. Have you guys used the Liquify before? This is kind of fun. Watch this. So, do you see how my grain is here? If I use this guy, do you see how I can waver it? So depending on the resolution and how much pressure and stuff I'm using, see how I can start to make these a lot more, I can start to pull stuff a little bit more and make some of those patterns in the wood that I might want. So it's not 100% pure. One other cool thing you can do with this, if we look at the tools here, There's one called pucker and there's one called bloat. So let's say I want to put a knot in the wood. Watch this. This is kind of fun. I tighten up my brush and I pick an area, let's say right about here. See that? And I could actually go in and start to make some little knots that later on I can just darken and pull that area out and make it knots in the wood. That's the bloat. The pucker does the opposite. So if I increase this, you see I can kind of tighten it up. So at times you want to turn down the density of some of these. But you see how I'm starting to get more variance in the pattern of the wood, right? And I could start to change and modify that. So depending on what it is I'm trying to do, how much pressure, how much density, I could start to really make this a lot more organic looking, right? I can add, here's the only thing you have to be careful of when you start adding like little knot holes and stuff is remember this is going to be a tiling texture. So if I make them too obvious and the tile is repeating too often and it's a big open space, you're going to see these perfectly spaced knot holes every repetition. So just be careful about making something too distinct when you're actually doing some stuff. I just wanted to show you how to do it, but yeah, just keep that in mind. That sometimes that may work against you a little bit. There's a twirl tool, which is a little weird. You can actually, you see that? It kind of gives just this variance here, which is kind of nice, but if you have it cranked up too high, it may start to do some weird things. And just remember the size of the brush is going to kind of tweak some things out. Cool. So can you guys see that? So we got a decent pattern. I can change some of the values and the colors of it later, but I just wanted to get a wood pattern that would actually work out. And let me go back. Once I get it the way I like it, I hit OK. And now it's saved onto this version. You notice I keep duplicating layers because then if I make a mistake on something, I can always go back a step and just say, oh man, I don't like the way that went. Let me just go back rather than having to redo the whole thing over and over again. One thing I'm also missing is I don't have an edge on the right side or the left side. So if I go back to brush and I want to make sure that I actually create a edge on one of these sides, because remember it's going to tile up and down and left and right. So I'm just going to increase that brush a little bit and then run across the side so I can have a nice little little edge to it. There we go. So I'm going to duplicate that one. And one thing I want to do now is start to realign these planks so that they would actually tile seamlessly. So now might be a good time if I wanted to go to a 2K texture of selecting this thing, pasting it into a 2K image, and then have more to work with. I'm not going to worry about it because my scene isn't too big and there's a lot of furniture, so you're not going to see a ton of the floor at any given time. There's a big, there's a carpet, there's couches, there's all that stuff. If it was a big open space, I'd be more worried about it, but you're not going to see like a big empty space. So what I might want to do now, before I go further, is make sure that this is tiling okay. So this is a 1024 by 1024 image. So I'm going to go to Filter, Other, Offset. And then I type in half the resolution of my offset, so it's 512 by 512. And what you'll see, 512 by 512 wraparound, and what you'll see, and I hit OK, is where we would see the seam here. So if I repeat it, this is what I would see. And I'm like, yeah, that's, if it were offset, that's okay. Because, like, oh, this could be the seams between them. But I'm not going to actually do it that way. I want to get rid of this, and then I'll put in the horizontal seams between the planks. So I just need to get rid of these seams here that are happening. And there's a few ways I could do that. One, I could use the stamp tool. We'll stop that. So we press S for the stamp tool, Alt, or I believe on the Mac computer it's Option. So Alt left mouse clicks where we're going to stamp from. And then I can just start to cover that up a bit. Presuming that I have it cranked up high enough. See? So I could start to blend that out a bit. To get rid of some of these edges. So that's one way of doing it. I just have to be careful because I don't want to make a brand new, when I'm using the stamp tool or the clone tool, I don't want to make a new pattern that's going to repeat. I want to get rid of the patterns. You might also, in this case, want to use, adjust the hardness of your brush, because otherwise it's going to start to soften the edge too much. So I click right here and I increase my hardness of the edge of the brush, and that way it's not going to make things too faded. And I like to come up from the top and the bottom to kind of add these. Another way of doing it is to use the healing brush. So if I use let's try the spot healing brush tool, which basically when you have the spot healing brush, you just have to be careful of not crossing it with a hard contrast area. And what it does is it basically looks and says, some of these things don't match. So when I put my, let me just show you when I zoom in, I put my spot healing brush over it, and you see it kind of tries to fix that. But you have to be careful. That actually worked pretty well. It's softening it out a little bit too much for me, but I can always just kind of, once again, make some adjustments to it. So that helps out a little bit. Another option would be using the smudge tool. But what'll happen is it's happening, but it's starting to like blur it out too much. Even if I go in just a straight direction, it starts to create a little bit of a pattern there that I might have to correct inside of Liquify. And then yet another way would be taking some of, like, copying the texture and then pasting it and blending it across the edge to kind of hide it. So what you're noticing is that there's a whole bunch of ways of doing the same bloody thing. And sometimes it's just a matter of going, like, if I go back to Liquify on this and say, you know what, I'm going to just kind of pull these maybe across and hopefully get a little bit of a better blend. Yeah, I think I need to just blend those more. So here's where we could actually blend that out. Oh, and one other thing. Watch this. I could go into an area like this, make a selection of that area with a little extra. I'm going to go select, modify, and feather that, which will soften out the edge. So let me soften that out by, say, about maybe about 8 pixels. And now inside of that area, I do a motion blur. Look at that. Do you see that? And then depending on how much, because I feathered it, it's blending a lot better with the edges as it goes towards the edge. See? And then I literally could just keep pulling this selection over a bit and doing that. Control F. Oh, that's right, they changed the shortcut. And it's now Alt Control F. It's so annoying. Years of having the same frickin' shortcut, and then they're like, oh wait, let's change that. That'd be fun. And once again, I'm not going to stress too much about it because the simple fact is this is going to be repeated and all that good stuff. So I just want to make sure that it's not so obnoxiously noticeable that someone's going to see it. But it'll be fine. So just run these across a little bit. There we go. Just to get that going. Sweet. And then I could just say filter, other, offset it again just to set it back and make sure I haven't created any brand new repeats. And we're almost done. All I'd have to do is make the horizontal cuts. And I'm going to put that on a brand new layer just to see how that would work. So one thing I like to do for it is I imagine that there's going to be 2 primary cuts. So on a brand new layer, I got a brush. Now, this is not how it would actually work. I have to fix some things. So what I would do is I would start to get rid of every other horizontal cut. And I'm just shift selecting to add those in. And then I'm going to have to fix this one over here, which will be fine. But if I just delete those, you see how I have this pattern happening? We'll get rid of this one. So boom, 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 boom. Now, the one thing that's off with this one is that I'm going to have two that are like right next to each other. So I'm just going to take this one here and make you the oddball. And I'll just pull you down like maybe halfway. Something like that. And we do something like that. There we go. And actually, let's pull you down to about there. Is this making sense so far of just like the setup for it? So now that I've got this pattern here, and okay, that one's a little bit off, but I'm okay with that. And I could even just get rid of this one if I wanted to. And just say it's like, oh, it's just split there. Or even offset some of these so that they're not quite as perfect. And that's the cool part about taking this, because it's like, oh, sweet, I can actually, oops. Just modify some of these just to vary things up a little bit. So it just depends, but you can set it up the way you want. The thing you have to remember is that I also need that second piece, otherwise it's just a cut, and then we have this long piece here, if that makes sense. So let me just take that, duplicate it. Oops. And I could just make whatever variation that I want from that. Oh, stop it. So whatever pattern you make, just keep that in mind, that some of the stuff that you're going to be doing on it, you may want to actually go in make variations of and kind of double it up a little bit. One other way of doing it is that if you have something like this one, Control left mouse, then I pull that up. There we go. So I have 2 on each, which gives me a good breakup. And if I say, you know what, I like that. Now I can go in, select all, Control A, edit, copy, merged, paste. And now I can go in and I could start to vary up some of the color. And I could start with a base color, like if I put make a brand new layer on top of this, and then just fill it. With a brown that I might want. Alt backspace to fill. So I just filled a brand new layer with nothing on it with this, and now I just change the blending mode to get, you see that? To get a different color of how I want that on top of it. And you see the different blending modes do different things. The cool thing about doing it this way is if I have it on this layer, I can always do adjustments to that one layer, like hue and saturation and desaturate it a little bit, something like that. I could change the coloring of it. And then I could just kind of continue to see different patterns of how I want to blend that together with it and give me a starting point. So that's using a hard light, linear light, and once I have that in place, then I could do some cool stuff like this, where we go in and we start to change some of these panels so that they're slightly different from each other. Just remember, if I make a selection, like let's say this one down here, this one continues up at the top. So if I grab this whole section right here, I have to deselect, Alt left mouse, this piece here, because that doesn't continue. Does that make sense? So I can make some selections like this, or I could do them one by one. And once again, remember to deselect the one that in the row that's, or in the column that's not supposed to be affected. Control U, or select the layer, Control U, and then I can, do you see that? Where I'm desaturating and changing the color of just some of those planks to vary things up a little bit. I don't want them so radically off that it, unless that's a design choice, you typically want them to be somewhere in the vicinity of the same, kind of values and stuff. But this will actually make it so it's a little bit easier, and then I could even adjust just the levels of that area. So I can start to get a nice variation between them, and then I'd choose a few more and do sort of the same deal. I might even take some of these and rotate them if they're in the center so that the grain is broken up a little bit more. Any questions so far? Control U, change the saturation or the different look that you want from it, just so we can start to get some variance in there. There might even be a few that are more green or something, or have just a little bit more yellow to them. But you start to see how, like, oh, cool, I can make these variations, and I'm not even done yet, but I'm not. I'm just going to go a little bit further and then show you guys, and then we'll jump to something else. But I just wanted to show you a few techniques that might help you out, and hopefully you'll be thinking about different ways that you could actually go in and tweak this out to your advantage of something else that you might want to do. I might give it a little bit of noise overall on the entire thing as well. Ooh, way less. Filter, noise, and just tone that down a lot just to give it just a little bit of graininess to it. Uniform. Edit, copy merged, paste. And you could even do some fun stuff, just like adding another motion blur and then blending it in, just to kind of soften if you don't like how much it's actually doing it. But just to give you some ideas. And then I would just put the, that's kind of neat. If I put the brakes on top of it, then these might be some nice colors that I could actually use for it and just kind of tweak it out from there and just blend it on top. But it's just kind of nice to see like these different patterns that you can make. So once I'm all done, and if I got this exactly the way I want it, or at least something I could work with, and you know, I spent time like making whatever adjustments I needed to, then I'd be ready to take this into bitmap to material and spit out those other textures like the normal map and stuff that I wanted to. Oops, and don't forget you. Actually. So let's do that now. I just want to adjust these. Those are a little bit harsh, so I'm just going to lighten those a little bit. This is also the last point where if I wanted to put in stuff like nails, this would be the time to do it. I would prefer just to do it so it's I use the brush, I sample a dark color, very dark, make it just a little bit darker than that, but not a black, just dark. And now I can go in and start putting in those holes of where the nails would be, like that. I put them on a separate layer because if after all at the end I don't like it, I can always just turn that layer off. I don't have to try and go and stamp them out and get rid of them. Does that make sense? It's like I always want to do things in a way that I can always go back, so it's not like, oh my god, that's so permanent. I have to redo this whole freaking thing again. And this is my construction history. If I wanted to, I could even go in and start doing some stuff like adding chips and stuff if this is weathered. So just so you can see how I would do that real quick, let me just show you this. And then I would make, if I start doing this, I'd have to make my own custom bump map that I would then turn into a normal map. But check this out. If I wanted to have like a wood chip, just so you could see how to do it, I go in with my, like let's say my lasso tool, and I choose an area that's supposed to be chipped like this. Control H to hide the selection, but it's still there. Control U, and I can lighten that area. Do you see that? And maybe even change the hue of it a bit. See? To add these little chips that are on the corners. If this is going to be something that I'm going for a painterly cartoon style, then I would embed the lighting. And what that would be is this. I would take this area here, check this out, if I want to do like a little chip, and then I'll add another one right here. Maybe somebody dropped something and it kind of broke a part of the wood off. And I would copy paste. So there's just this, piece that's on top of there. Now this is only if I'm doing a painterly style and I'm not doing like normal maps and all that kind of stuff. And then I would do this. I would add an effect to it. I would bevel it. You could start to see it appearing. I would bevel it down. More depth like that. Can you see that starting to appear? And then I would kind of change the coloring of that. So that I've got these chips. Can you see that? So I basically have chipped away the wood right here. And that's a good way of doing that. You can use that technique for pots. You can use it for metal chips. And just by going in and adjusting the bevel, and then I could start wearing and just add a dirt area around it and start dirting things up. But I don't want that. But I just wanted to show you how that would look. So once I have all of this, File, Save As. And I will save this, just so you can see it. I'll save it as a JPEG. Usually I use it, I save it as a Targa. But for right now, and I'll just call this one wood tile _CL. Now I would just go into bitmap to material. And I simply drag that into bitmap to material. Drag it, there's my file, I drag it right into where it says drop here, how nice, and put it in the main input. Ooh, look at that. And it's already generating a normal map and pushing in those little pieces. So I'm going to actually save this one out as just making the wood, and then we'll go over the rest in another video.